Welcome, everyone. I'm Alexander Stepanovich, founder of Cascades Analytics, a media and advisory platform covering the psychedelics and neuroplastogen pipeline. We go where the action is. We talk with the founders, the scientists, the regulators, the therapists, the people shaping the next wave of psychiatric drugs. My guest today is Rachel Yehuda, Vice Chair of Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, the Chemers Neustein Family Professor of Trauma and Resilience at Mount Sinai, and Director of the Parsons Research Center for Psychedelic Healing at Mount Sinai. Rachel is a world-leading researcher in the neurobiology of trauma and PTSD. She has authored more than 500 papers, chapters, and books on traumatic stress and its neurobiology. Her work spans risk and resilience factors, predictors of treatment response, and the genetics and epigenetics of trauma, including its intergenerational transmission. But more importantly for us, she is a pioneer in psychedelic-assisted therapy for PTSD, starting with MDMA, but not only, as we'll see. Rachel, welcome to Cascades Analytics Live. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. So let me start with a first question. What has actually changed in how we treat PTSD over the last decade? What hasn't?
Well, I'm not sure how much has changed in the last decade. I think we're still prioritizing cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, certainly in settings like the VA and community settings. We're still administering SSRIs and other drugs. I think people are very interested in the potential for psychedelics, but we haven't really had a big breakthrough, although people really feel that it's time to have one because the current tools that we have are leaving a lot of people with the need for more healing.
And what did we learn from the Lykos FDA rejection about how MDMA-assisted therapy should be developed?
I think we learned that we need to maintain rigorous standards for drug development research. I think, the latest guidance that the FDA just issued, it's really clear that the FDA is trying to support psychedelic drug development, but they don't want to relax the evidentiary standards. So there were just a lot of questions that people had with how the studies were designed. I think going for the first indication with the need to institute a specific psychotherapy ended up being complicated. The expectancy issue, the really lack of blinding or the difficulty in blinding, I think it was hard. And the FDA said what it still needed. They needed more data on durability and safety and efficacy. So I think we learned that those things need to be in place. And I think many people are hearing that message and trying to put it in place.
And how is the FDA's final psychedelics guidance going to impact MDMA-assisted therapy, you think?
Well, I'm not sure how it will impact. I think that where the rubber meets the road there is really about how the sponsor frames the use of the drug in connection with psychotherapy. I think, there are several issues that have to be dealt with. I think the durability is one of them. There has to be some data. I believe the FDA is asking for data that shows that the effects that you see at treatment end, which are fantastic, last. And I'm not sure why the FDA is applying a unique standard of durability to psychedelics. It doesn't have this standard for other drugs that have been approved in the past. Now for ketamine, that would be a very difficult thing for ketamine because ketamine doesn't have durable effects. But maybe one of the reasons that they're focused on it is because the effect sizes are so large, larger than what we've seen with other approaches. And I think because people definitely know that they've taken a drug, they feel so different. There's such powerful subjective effects, sometimes mystical effects. I think there people want to be sure that the treatment effects are durable, because there's a very big difference between feeling like you've just had an amazing experience, which you often feel after you take a psychedelic, and having your mental health symptoms um, no longer be there, or feeling recovered from the illness or the psychological condition that caused you to do the treatment to begin with. And so making this distinction between feeling good and really being better is what I think is at the heart of the durability concern. Again, I think the functional unblinding issue is a problem for the FDA. If you ask me, I don't think it's that big a problem that you know that you're taking a drug. I think expectancy is part of healing. That's why we have placebo effects um, in general. And I don't think that they're necessarily a negative thing. I mean, just the simple fact that you can guess what you've taken may not be enough to have a durable effect. Maybe that's another reason that durability is being emphasized, because maybe the expectancy can result in a short-term gain, but it would be very hard to pin a 12-month gain on the fact that you knew you were taking a drug. So the FDA isn't saying that subjective effects invalidate the treatment. It's just saying that when subjective effects reveal the treatment assignment, that we have to work harder to establish what really caused the clinical improvement. So that's front and center now, along with durability.
Mhm. You talked about also the fact that some patients can go in therapy with in a maybe with a um, passive not behavior, but not willing to face the trauma in a way, thinking that the drug will do everything for them. So it's kind of a blinding to yourself in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you asked what have we learned from treating trauma. I think that was your first question, but
Mhm.
I think by now we should know the difference between a patient that would like relief from symptoms, which drugs can do pretty well, and a patient that wants to work to recover from trauma. And those things are not the same objectives at all. Um, you know, what is unique about the psychedelic opportunity is that it allows us not just to address or suppress symptoms, but it addresses a more important question, which is what enables recovery? How can you change the brain in a way that makes it possible for new learning or emotional engagement or revisiting traumatic memories or restoring social connection? Resilience isn't a molecule. It's an emergent property of biological, psychological, and social processes that interact over time, and changing how people process what happens to them in their lives and helping them regulate emotions, reconnect with others, and rebuild their lives. That's what trauma therapy is about. And yes, there's a role for a psychedelic intervention, but that's quite different than saying, here, take this medicine and you can sleep, or it will suppress your sympathetic nervous system, or it may deal with your nightmares. And I think that model is very familiar to the FDA. It's the model that many people come to expect when they go to see a doctor. Doctor will give me a drug that will make my symptoms go away, or it will dull my symptoms. And what we should have learned by now about trauma and PTSD is that it's not simply a neurobiologic issue to tinker with rewiring. Something terrible happened, and it has to be processed. And so, um, I would have liked the FDA to have said explicitly in the case of trauma that therapeutic actions can arise not only from pharmacologic action, but from the interaction of a drug with experience, expectation, clinical context, support, and that drug development programs should evaluate these components rather than presuming that the drug is the sole agent and the rest of the stuff is confounds. Um, we have to characterize the psychological intervention and see whether it modifies efficacy and durability, and determine whether it's necessary. It may be, it may not be. It may depend on the drug, it may depend on the person, but it's not a confound exactly. In a clinical sense, maybe it is in a drug development stance.
Mm-hmm. Does MDMA produce lasting remission, or are we looking at repeated sessions over time, over long periods of time? We don't know yet, but
our study at the VA, which we completed and we're submitting now for publication, showed very durable effects at 6 and 12 months, with no patient having been with no patient receiving a dose of MDMA in the interim. Some people continued to seek therapy, but they did it in a very different way. But the gains were not only durable, but they actually strengthened over time. I think as people used what they learned through the sessions to try to make change in their lives. Will that always happen? Probably not to everyone. And again, this goes back to the question you asked earlier about some people think that healing is more passive than it really is. Therapists call it doing the work. Doing the work isn't just popping the drug in your mouth. Doing the work is revisiting the really difficult stuff and trying to rebuild your life. That doesn't come only from changing the neurobiology. And so, again, it just needs to be studied. So I think that the FDA is pretty clear that they don't want like a transient state to make somebody feel like, oh, I'm healed, I'm cured. I just had this incredible mystical experience. But you don't want to, and that's legitimate, and I agree with it, but you don't want to swing too far either and make it seem like recovery is something that is an emergent property of neurobiological rewiring, because that's not quite true either.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that applies specifically to MDMA assisted therapy or to all of psychedelic-assisted therapies?
I don't know what applies specifically or universally because we just don't have the experience to know.
Right. Mm-hmm.
What does seem pretty clear is that there isn't a specific, quote, dose of psychotherapy that needs to be applied to everyone, and there may not even be a specific type of psychotherapy that needs to be applied to everyone. But we are kind of mincing words sometimes when we talk about psychological support versus psychotherapy, in a way that often feels to me like we're trying to minimize psychotherapy. If you're requiring the support to come from a licensed clinician, it's psychotherapy. You can call it whatever you want. But if it's just support, what would you need a licensed therapist for, a clinician? So again, once we're talking about preparation, and once we're talking about integration, and once we're talking about someone being in the room when it happens, whatever word you want to use for it, it's not drug alone. And so it has to be kind of incorporated into the mix. And it has to be described accurately for what it is. I think, in the first few years of the psychedelic renaissance, or whatever we called it, I always felt there was so much conversation about drug actions and not enough about, the non-drug factors. And now we're talking about those too. And so we're gonna figure it out, because we have to talk about all these things.
How do you see the advantage of MDMA over, for example, methylone or ibogaine, psilocybin for PTSD?
Again, when you ask someone like me that question, I would want to look at a study that compared directly MDMA and methylone, and there haven't been those studies. I would like to do that study, actually, because I think that the methylone model is presenting an alternative that I think the FDA and conventional academic medicine is very comfortable with. It reminds me more of a model like ketamine, where you're basically asserting that much of the action is coming from the medicine. It's repeated dosing. The drug focuses on the fact that the subjective effects are less powerful and possibly less important, and that the psychotherapy or facilitation may also be, less important. So the drugs chemically are kind of similar. Methylone is maybe less potent, shorter acting. And so it provides a really interesting contrast, especially regarding durability. And it allows us to ask the question of whether the subjective experience during the session is part of what is healing. If you ask patients, they'll say yes if they've had that experience. But if they haven't had that experience, can they still heal? Sure. I mean, maybe. So the question, we're going to learn a lot by taking that seriously. So, if I had the opportunity to do a study that is a head-to-head comparison of these two treatment approaches, I might even want to do one where you alter the amount of psychotherapy in each of these drugs, with maybe providing less psychotherapy for MDMA or more psychotherapy for methylone, and seeing really what's going on there. Because it's something, what's at issue right now is whether we're studying an interaction of a drug with a therapy, or we're really trying to study drugs and treating everything else like confounding variables. I think that one of the things we should have learned from experience is not to do that, because right now psychotherapy alone isn't producing the desired outcomes, and medication alone isn't producing the desired outcomes. Why would we regress back to the model of, it's the drug, let's just get the drug right? Why won't we lean into the opportunity here to use a drug to help process difficult material and help patients change their lives, or reconnect or re-engage or develop resilience, which is not the absence of symptoms per se. It's really kind of the rebuilding. And so that's where I think we should be taking the next step, that people, you can give someone a sleeping pill. If they complain that my problem is I can't sleep at night, and then you give them a sleeping pill, they'll be grateful for the sleep, but they're not going to say, Eureka, I'm healed. So I think that space in between that good night's sleep that you've just provided and all the other stuff that still needs to be dealt with is where we should be really looking to see how any drug can be optimized with factors other than just the drug alone. It's just my opinion, but it's actually a strong opinion. So.
No, it's fascinating. I think you mentioned in an interview that the session of MDMA assisted therapy was actually helping the patient to get unstuck from that traumatic original moment where that he or she keeps revisiting, trying to second guess, am I a monster? Why did I do that? Why did I leave the building when it was on fire? Should I have helped, etc.? And that feedback loop that is becoming a mental prison, and that need for the medication and the therapy to help the patient reframe the narrative. And so there is kind of a new class of drugs that help reframe the narrative. But how can you reframe a narrative without support?
Yeah, so reframe the narrative isn't something that the drug does. The drug enables maybe a state. Maybe it's a state of plasticity that promotes new learning. Maybe it's a state that promotes empathy or connectedness. You know, we're learning about what is exactly the state that the psychedelic drug permits. But in order to see something differently, you know, what are the components of that, right? We've been trying to figure that out for a long time. Is it that you have to have a cognitive moment, right? Do you have to correct an assumption? Is it an emotional moment? Do you have to just look at yourself with forgiveness and self-compassion? I mean, what is it really? And I think the answer is that it may be different things for different people, and it may depend on what happened. And also what we know about people that suffer from mental health symptoms is it's not just one thing that happened. It's like your whole life that happened. All the things that happened to you when you were young in your childhood, how you were raised, how people responded to you, how many successes and failures you've had. It's just everything together. And so sometimes when you're trying to process things in psychotherapy without medication, it just takes a long time. You have to go one event at a time. You can't process material in a parallel fashion. And with psychedelics, you're all over the place sometimes. You see yourself in a lot of different stages. You're kind of all over the place. And you know, it really lets you kind of have a very different kind of embodied experience also. But the drug doesn't do it. You do it. The person does it. The drug enables it. And so that is different. And so then when you talk about what are the biologic effects of a drug, you know, those would presumably be the same biologic effects when taken recreationally and not necessarily in healing context. So we have to be very precise about what is the role of the neurobiology of the compound and what does it interact with in the context of healing.
Yes. But do you think in the long term methylone could displace MDMA, or are they serving different clinical needs? And do you think we need to stratify PTSD patients by the pharmacological profile of these compounds?
I think that methylone offers a different approach in, and it could be valuable for many people. And MDMA offers an approach in that could be valuable for many people. And, you know, one of the things that has really happened that I think is a potential game changer is the agreement that the FDA has made with the VA. That is really going to allow the VA to start doing the kind of studies that maybe are not done by sponsors and sharing them with the FDA. And this is exactly the kind of study that, you know, might be very useful, you know, just really putting it in the hands of an agency that really has to deal with a big problem of PTSD and may be able to take quite a sophisticated approach about real world patients and how to modify things and you know, be able to give those data to the FDA. I apologize for the noise that I know that is on my end, but
oh, no problem. But you could imagine maybe protocol where MDMA, you start with MDMA and maybe down the line you have just methylone kind of short session a year later or 2 years later, things like that,
I
kind of
can't
heavy.
really speak about methadone because
Right.
I personally we have not studied it. I don't have any personal experience with it, although I think I would really like to see the difference. But again, we're going to have a lot of different options for people, and we should lean into that. And the mistakes that we have made in the past really concern saying this is the way you treat a condition. And what we really want to have are a lot of tools for clinicians to use because patients are really very different one from the other and may require different approaches in. Some people might want to have an experience where they don't have as much psychotherapy or may not be as practical in some settings than others. Again, having different kind of options is important, but I guess my issue is really just to highlight the difference between an interaction between a drug and a non-drug factor, and really trying to claim that the non-drug factor has to be isolated so that we can really look at what the drug is going to do, how the drug is effective. And here, because these are also drugs that have a long history of recreational use and use in contexts that are not designed to deal with mental health symptoms, this may be a problem.
The MDMA-assisted therapy session is focusing on the patient's self and how that, the subject, and I'm interested in the MDMA-assisted therapy for transgenerational trauma.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on?
Well, we're actually doing a study on that right now, but we're actually using psilocybin. And the sessions are very interesting because in the beginning, there's less talking, right? We have several prep sessions. When in the dosing of psilocybin, it may be very internal for the first few hours, but then there is psychotherapy after, and we are applying a very similar kind of psychotherapeutic model for psilocybin as for MDMA, but it's attenuated. We have published a treatment manual called IMAP, Integrative MDMA Assisted Therapy, which is really a model that is quite compatible for all psychedelics because its guiding framework is to follow the patient's process. I think in trauma work, where you start to have a lot of debate among experts, and that even before you introduce the psychedelic, is really whether you should guide the experience. Cognitive behavioral approaches are therapist directed, meaning the therapist it gives the patient a syllabus. This is how we're going to discuss it. These are common reactions. This is how I'm going to educate you about trauma. This is how we're going to discuss it. This is the homework that you'll get. This is why we're doing what we're doing. It orders the treatment into different sessions. And many people thrive on this kind of structure and benefit greatly from it. It's particularly useful when there's one very specific event that is really troubling. But when there's just a lot going on and people feel like they're just one big hot mess and just they have so much trauma now and then and all over the place, it's very hard to take that same kind of directed approach. Psychedelics sometimes pull out material that you weren't even aware what were contributing to your current clinical state. So to me, it makes sense to have a patient-directed approach where, ironically, you might use some of the same skills of cognitive reframing and extinguishing fear and all those kinds of things. You might use a lot of those tools, but you're letting the patient determine what the next move you make is, rather than your protocol. When we did studies of cognitive behavioral therapy, adherence to the protocol was really important. Do it this way. And so now people are thinking about how to combine these cognitive behavioral therapies within psychedelics. And what they're saying is, well, yeah, we have to be flexible. Well, yeah, that's the whole point of using a patient direction approach. You have to be flexible. So I think we're saying a lot of the same things, saying flexibility but using a therapist directed cognitive behavioral approach. What do you mean by flexibility? And I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation. And part of it, I think, is that we're comfortable sometimes asserting that we're using something that has been, quote, evidence-based, something that's been standardized and widely disseminated and has a lot of evidence. But we really don't have a lot of evidence on how to use this kind of an approach with a drug that produces a non-ordinary state, or whether that's even a good idea. So we sort of have to start from scratch anyway, to build that evidence. But it's a reasonable question to ask. I think, for me, it's just a gain when people understand that the patient has a lot of processing to do. They have to feel their feelings. They have to figure out how to rebuild their lives, how to be not avoidant, socially isolated. It's not just a matter of reducing the PTSD symptoms. I mean, that's another thing the FDA did not talk about, which is, to me, a very interesting point, which is that we're still using outcomes that involve reduction of symptoms, whether it be for depression or PTSD or whatever condition that you're going for an indication for. And the opportunity of psychedelics is really to build resilience, or to think about outcomes that go beyond whether or not symptoms are being expressed. Because I can tell you from my work, people can tolerate having symptoms in the context of a life that gives them extraordinary meaning, or a life in which they're socially engaged. So I think one of the opportunities is to also think about what recovery is. What do we mean by helping a patient with mental health symptoms be well? Is it just reduction of symptoms, or do we also want them to develop self-compassion, or to develop post-traumatic growth, or have better social functioning, or better quality of life? What is it that we want for our patients, in addition to reducing the quote symptoms of their quote illness? What about their spiritual well-being, and their physical well-being, and their somatic experiences? I mean, and their ability to be in relationship.
I think it's probably too soon to say, but is there any improved or a bigger resilience? I don't know what adjective could apply, but to someone who had MDMA assisted therapy and faces a new trauma, and how does that person react to the trauma? Is it going to be worse, or is it going to be better? Because is that person going to be able to process the trauma better because of prior MDMA assisted therapy, or is it going to crumble the freshly recovered resilience?
Again, the jury's out. We have to do research on this. I mean, there were some fascinating studies that came out of Israel after October 7th about slightly improved outcomes for people who were taking psychedelics at the time during the Nova Festival, some psychedelics. And so they might be doing a little better, according to this research, which to me, at first, I was very surprised by. So that's a question. we have had some of our patients say that they do approach the stresses in their lives differently.
Mhm.
Our patients was a firefighter, so continues to be exposed, but we don't know. And we can't assume. And one of the problems, and I think the FDA guidance, if you read between the lines, I think they're saying, look, we're excited about these compounds, but please don't give us the hype. Give us the data. You
Mhm.
know, really, and by data, we want positive effects, all negative effects, adverse effects. We want to know euphoria, hallucinations, perceptual changes, cognitive changes, mood changes. We want to document everything. Um,
Drug interaction as well. New
yes,
drug interaction
we
for
want to
MDMA.
know which things are positive or therapeutically meaningful, not not just harmful things. So we want. I think the real question is, how does an experience that alters your perception in the moment really take on a life of its own much, much later in terms of the trajectory of your mental wellness? So really, I think a higher standard is being applied on one level, but on another level, it's a very familiar drug-based model. Like, the FDA is almost saying, "Please just tell me what the drug does." Um, and a clinician would say, "No, I don't care just about what the drug does. I care about how the drug can help bring the patient along towards recovery." The clinician would be a little bit more interested in how the drug can interact with other kinds of psychotherapeutic process. So, but the FDA, I think, is open to psychotherapy. Psychological interventions could become part of a product label if the sponsor, you know, specifies this. That would be more work for the sponsor. So I don't know how many would want to take that on. They might need to specify what kinds of psychotherapy. They might need to, you know, determine what kind of manuals would be good. I think for industry, I can understand a reluctance to 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 say that the drug is an interaction with psychotherapy. Um, but that's why I'm glad that the FDA is looking for data outside, from real world studies, from studies that would be conceptualized by people that, live in these complex clinical environments where they have to have answers.
Mhm.
So I think that that's a very positive development. Um,
Eh, one side question. You initially worked on the neurobiology of epigenetics of glucocorticoids, gene and their acetylation or histones methylations and to in for a transgenerational traumatic patients like the offsprings and the parents. Is there any studies on the effect of psychedelics on those methylations and or epigenetics in general?
yes, there's already been one paper published from the phase 3 MAPS trials that I was involved in.
Oh, okay.
And we did show in that paper that there were changes in some of the stress-related epigenetic changes in stress-related genes. And we're going to be publishing a paper. We have looked at this in the context of our MDMA assisted therapy trial. So I think a lot of people are now including many measures, biologic measures, physiologic measures, so that they can really study these kinds of biologic processes. It's also a safety issue. I think that one of the things in the FDA guidance continues to be a focus on safety monitoring, um, and also who should be doing it, whether you need a licensed independent practicing clinician, to be able to monitor safety, or what level of person can do this. But the biologic data really does help with safety,
Mhm.
potentially, depending on what you measure and when. And safety is not limited to, of course, blood pressure, cardiac events, and all those kinds of things. But safety can also be interpersonal conduct and boundaries and suggestibility, and how you protect patients while they're psychologically vulnerable. And these are the things that I think were very concerning in mainstream mental health and psychiatry, because let's face it, we know that abuses have occurred and they can occur. And so I think that we have to have safeguards so that they don't occur, or that the effects are minimized. When in an MDMA trial, for example, if a patient says, "I want to be held," right, which is something that can happen, you have to be careful about what kind of holding, for how long. It has to be planned and discussed in advance. What kind of holding is not going to happen? What kind of holding is going to happen? What kind is appropriate? And also, different practitioners may relate to touch differently. When a nurse touches a patient, that's very much within a scope of practice, in a very different way than for a psychiatrist. So I think all of these issues have to be very carefully examined, because you know these are drugs that cause a transient altered state, in which you may want or need, or think you need, um, different kind of things. And so this preparation, which I think is psychotherapy, that happens before the experience, is really critical in kind of planning for this and discussing it and reviewing it, and what is going to happen, what can't happen, what can't possibly happen, and what it means to be vulnerable, and to put your trust in a monitor and a facilitator when you're in an altered state, and what that really feels like, and kind of also playing out the kind of interventions that would work and would not work when you're under
Mhm.
that kind of state. So I think I call all of that psychotherapy. We could call it facilitation and psychological support, but it isn't just here's the drug. And it probably does affect the experience quite a bit.
Mhm. On the epigenetics of stress-related genes, after psychedelics, it could be interesting also to see if there's an effect of therapy on these markers.
Yes, the the kind of studies that I think we really do need to do right now really look at those kinds of differences. What happens with drug alone? What happens with their interaction? What happens with therapy alone? We've done many studies looking at epigenetic changes before and after psychotherapy. So, in the paper that we are writing now, that will hopefully come out soon, be submitted soon, I should say, we're actually comparing what happens with MDMA to what happens with cognitive processing therapy.
Mm.
So that's the first step, looking at because the question is really whether the epigenetic changes relate to recovery, or just the state of being no longer with PTSD, whether
Mhm.
that's the epigenetics we're looking at, or whether we're looking at how the treatment changed things.
Mhm.
And that's a very different kind of question. And so, what I think we bring to the psychedelic movement, you said I'm I have a big track record of psychedelics. Actually, no, I have a big track record in PTSD.
Right.
Uh, that's what I'm bringing. So I'm bringing decades of observation around the biology of PTSD to be able to understand whether we've got something new here, or whether we've been just looking at a biology of healing, which is a big deal too. But real question for clinicians is, does it matter how the patient heals? Does it matter what I really do? Or do I have to do something specific to get a specific kind of healing? You know, that's really at the core of what we need to be able to state just that clearly. Yes, it does because, or no, it actually doesn't because. And, you know, hopefully this opportunity with psychedelics will help us just answer that question, as long as we are able to take the wisdom that we have acquired from all the other things that we've learned before we even heard about psychedelics.
Mm-hmm. One last question for you, Rachel. Do you think there's a serious infrastructure bottleneck between approval and actual patient access?
Well, there will be many bottlenecks
Right.
that I think people are working really hard to address. The bottleneck of therapist training, we're very concerned about that and trying to be part of the solution for that. The bottleneck of making sure there are CPT codes and people can get credit for their work in clinical systems or reimbursed by insurance. You know, these are bottlenecks. I think that people will go slow in terms of the rollout, but I'm not really sure. So I think we should begin to be teaching about psychedelics in medical schools and in graduate school programs and in nursing schools and social work schools. I think it should become part of what people learn about right now so that we can hit the ground running. I think primary care clinicians need to be educated about psychedelics, not because they're going to be doing those things, but because their patients will. And so they're going to need to be able to understand what happened.
Well, thank you so much for your precious insights. That was fascinating. Stay with me just 1 second as I wrap this up. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a fantastic conversation. If you have any questions, please DM me and I will forward them to Rachel Yehuda. And until next time, be well.